It begins with a river of blood. What follows is one of the most terrifying episodes in the Bible. The 10 Plagues of Egypt.
The 10 plagues are about a battle between the god presented in Exodus and Pharaoh.
God sends plague after plague against Pharaoh and his power, until at last, the angel of death is unleashed.
It's about destroying the gods of Egypt and showing that God is the one true God.
It's one of the most dramatic stories in the Old Testament. But today, many scholars believe it to be no more than a myth.
There is no indication in any pharaoh's reign of anything like the 10 plagues.
There is no evidence of anything of the Bible stories of the Exodus in Egypt.
But could the scholars be wrong? Now 2 scientists, probing the mystery, think they have found the answer. One is following the largest clue he can find.
The Bible is like a treasure map. If you are able to follow it carefully, yes, you will little by little find the treasure.
The other investigator is looking at the smallest of clues.
I believe the research I've done and published support the contention that the plagues did actually occur.
Both researchers believe that the plagues of Egypt are real. But can they uncover the truth? New York, 1994. Dr. John Marr is a disease detective. He is principal epidemiologist at the New York Department of Health. His job is to arrest the spread of deadly outbreaks of infection.
An epidemiologist really looks at an outbreak of a particular disease and attempts to orient it by time, place, and person. You attempt to explain why certain people were affected and others were not.
Reading a medical journal one day, Marr comes across an intriguing letter. Little does he know where it will lead him.
There was a letter to the editor, the title of which was The Third Plague of Egypt. And I sort of scratched my head.
Marr has not read the full account of the 10 plagues for many years.
So I went to my secretary, who was reading the Bible all the time, and I asked Betty, may I borrow your Bible? And she gave it up. And I read Exodus.
Marr is not a believer in the literal truth of the Bible. But what he reads about the plagues intrigues him.
I said, my goodness, many of these could be explained in scientific terms.
If the plagues can be explained scientifically, then perhaps they are much more than a myth. Marr now sets out on the quest of a lifetime to solve the mystery of the 10 plagues of Egypt. The Bible records that the Israelites spend generations enslaved by the Pharaohs. God speaks to Moses from a burning bush. He sends Moses back to Egypt to free his people. But the Pharaoh will not let them go. To make him change his mind, God then sends the 10 plagues. The waters of the Nile are turned to blood. Then come frogs, lice, flies. Animals die in the fields. Boils and blains afflict man and beast. Hail, locusts. A palpable darkness falls across the land. Then the final and most terrible plague of them all. The 10th plague. The death of the firstborn. It's a terrifying tale. But to disease detective John Marr, it's more than that. It's an epidemiological puzzle waiting to be solved. His first question: what evidence is there that the plagues really happened at all?
The first thing an epidemiologist does, if and when somebody suspects an epidemic, is to establish whether it really is an epidemic.
The Bible records that the Israelites in Egypt live in a place called Goshen. The plagues happen just before they leave, on a journey known as the Exodus.
The Exodus from Egypt, according to Jewish tradition, takes place in 14th century BCE.
The 14th century BCE is the time of the New Kingdom dynasties, when pharaohs, including Tutankhamun, rule Egypt. But outside the Bible, there is no reliable evidence of the 10 plagues.
There is no proof. There is no archaeological evidence for the Israelites at any stage in their journey. They have not been detected.
The Egyptian evidence for the presence of the Israelites in Egypt is precisely 0.
If the Israelites are living in Egypt for centuries, they're living under the radar.
If Egyptology can't find the evidence, maybe epidemiology can. To begin his quest, Marr must explain the first of the 10 plagues. The Nile running red with blood.
Moses, through the help of Aaron, turns the Nile into blood. It runs red and it runs like blood.
Now, obviously, that could not be literal, but maybe it was figurative. And if it was figurative, what might be the cause of this largest river in the world turning red?
To Marr, the most likely theory is a biological one.
I focused in on what appeared to be a logical explanation, which would be a algal bloom that would turn the water red.
Algal blooms occur when nutrients in water allow a huge explosion in phytoplankton populations. Because of their distinctive coloration, some are known as red tides. But there's a hitch. These red tides generally occur in salt water. The Nile River is not salty.
The problem was no one had described a massive red algal bloom in fresh water.
It's a critical stumbling block for disease detective John Marr. Months later, watching the evening news, Marr gets a lucky break.
Devastation today in North Carolina as highly toxic algae chokes a river. Residents fear the algae could be affecting their health.
In the early 90s, in North Carolina, there was a massive red algal bloom that turned a large river bright red, and it was a fresh water algal bloom.
Millions of fish in the River Neuse die as toxic algae overwhelms their habitat.
What was happening was a public health disaster.
The river runs red as blood, just as the Nile does in the Exodus story.
This certainly rang a bell. Here was a real example occurring at the time in North Carolina that essentially gave a rational, scientific explanation to the river turning to blood.
On the scene, Mark Blonder has the story.
Now Marr turns his scientific expertise on the second plague, the Plague of Frogs.
These frogs come up out of the Nile, they cover the land, even going into Pharaoh's palace, into Pharaoh's bedroom, into Pharaoh's bed.
But why do the biblical frogs abandon the river? For Marr, the answer is clear. They are fleeing the poison Nile.
The algal bloom would have been deleterious to the fish, and they could not leave the water. But frogs could, and they did.
Frogs must keep their skin moist to survive. Cut off from their natural habitat in the Nile and weakened by the toxic algae, the frogs die. They lie rotting in the hot Egyptian sun. The stage is set for the third plague.
After the frogs, there is the Plague of Lice.
The original Hebrew word is kinim, and kinim could mean lice or some kind of creepy crawly insect coming from the dust.
These bugs swarm into the city, and as lice do, land on the humans and begin to bite and to nibble at them.
Exodus predates any formal system of classifying insects. But Marr knows anything affecting both humans and animals cannot really be lice.
Insects like mosquitoes will bite anything warm and moving, animals and humans. But lice are species specific. There's the human body louse that only affects humans.
Marr is convinced that another biting insect fits the bill. The midge or gnat.
You can hardly see them when they bite you, but you know when you're bitten.
Marr believes that gnats explain the third plague. Now he's itching to solve the next.
After the lice, there are the flies. The flies, again, come and swarm into the land, and they affect the people. They affect especially the livestock.
This time, the Bible seems clear enough. Swarms of flies. But Marr discovers there are many subspecies of fly in Egypt. They don't all bite, and they don't all swarm.
We have house flies, horse flies, stable flies, black flies, sand flies, mango flies. Which fly was it? But it hurt. So you could throw out the house fly because it doesn't bite. You could throw out the horsefly, which does bite but doesn't swarm. Essentially, it left us with only one logical conclusion, which was the stable fly.
Despite the many doubters, Ma believes he has rational explanations for the first 4 plagues. More than that, he begins to see a deadly chain of cause and effect, leading from one to the next.
We had the water turning to blood, which killed the fish, which allowed the frogs to proliferate, but then escape onto the land. Their bodies would have provided nutrients for insect populations to grow. So then we had the midges, or gnats, exploding. And the stable fly loves the environment that would have been produced by the rotting of millions or billions of frogs in a stagnant river.
For Ma, this is a milestone in his investigation of the 10 plagues of Egypt.
At this point, plagues 1, 2, 3, and 4 began to be strung on a little wire very much like pearls, and they appeared to be interconnected.
If Ma is right, the chain of cause and effect should work its way through to the very final plague. If he can prove that, he's home and dry.
If you could prove that the 10 plagues had in fact taken place, then everything else follows. You do have an exodus.
It's a challenge Ma is ready to take on. But can his medical mind pass the test? Exodus reveals that despite the first 4 plagues, Pharaoh stubbornly refuses to free the Israelites. The stage is set for the 5th plague.
Next is a disease that falls on the animals.
Now Ma is back on his home territory. Disease.
Essentially, it's an affliction, a disease that affects only animals, but not humans.
The Bible says that Plague 5 kills both Egyptian cattle and horses. It's a puzzle for Dr. Ma. Very few diseases attack both these animal species, but spare humans. The disease detective digs deeper. Is there anything in the previous plagues which might explain the 5th? He discovers 2 animal diseases which share a single cause: the bite of a midge.
Blue tongue, which is a disease of ruminants, and African horse sickness. Both of these diseases are highly fatal, highly infectious, and both diseases are transmitted by the bite of a midge.
Ma now believes he has diagnosed the 5th plague: African horse sickness and ruminant blue tongue. The deadly chain of cause and effect is intact.
At this point, things are making sense.
The 6th plague is also a disease. This time, people too are affected.
The next plague is boils on men, humanity, and the beasts.
The 6th plague turns up the heat even more. We've moved from the beginning in the water to dry land to the animals to human themselves. It's getting closer and closer and hurting Pharaoh more and more.
Ma considers the symptoms as described in the Bible.
It had to be a cutaneous eruption, boils being obviously festering sores, and a blain is a blister. Now, we know that the stable fly can open the skin to infection.
Ma looks at infections, which might exploit the open sores caused by the stable fly bite. He finds one that fits the bill. Glanders.
It's a bacterial disease that can cause cutaneous eruptions, so glanders appeared to be a satisfactory explanation for the sixth plague.
It's another milestone in Ma's quest. Many scholars believe that the 10 plagues are pure myth. But the disease detective has now diagnosed the first 6. Medically, one plague leads on from another in a logical sequence. To Ma, that is compelling evidence that the biblical account is based on fact.
The author had no idea of the germ theory. They would not have known that this is a logical, scientific order of events. This would make me believe that it was much more likely to have been real and accurately described.
The next plague, the 7th, poses a unique challenge.
The next plague is hail. Not just hail, hail, lightning, fire, a sort of cosmic storm.
The 7th plague, the plague of hail, traditionally is ice with fire inside it, is about total decimation.
It's a puzzler for the disease detective. The first plague, the Nile turning to blood, is an act of God or a natural disaster caused by toxic algae. The next 5 plagues follow from that first plague in a deadly chain. But there doesn't seem to be anything connecting the first 6 to the plague of hail.
The 7th plague seemed to be out of sync. It was a natural phenomenon. It was hail. And I don't see how it related to the previous 6 plagues or how it could have had any relevance to the subsequent plagues. I was stumped.
Ma's quest seems set to be cancelled due to bad weather. Now, in Toronto, Canada, another scientist is inspired to investigate the 10 plagues of Egypt. Molecular biologist Ciro Trevisinato sets out on his quest after reading debates on the internet.
In the early days of the internet, many people were discussing the biblical plagues because there were such interesting, dramatic narrative inside the Bible. I got interested too.
Trevisinato decides to use his scientific skills to look for one single cause which will explain all 10 plagues.
And I looked at it at first, red waters, massacres of fish. Of course, what else? Algae. They go there and zack. They change the color of the waters. They kill the fish.
Trevisinato has experimented with algal blooms in the laboratory. But he quickly discovers that the algae theory won't go the distance.
The problem is, once you start with this explanation that it has short legs, you won't go that far. Sooner or later, puff, you end up in some kind of cul-de-sac or you hit a wall.
Ciro is stumped. Then, a chance meeting gives him a lucky break.
One day I went to see my friend Pasquale Zappia, who is the baker at the Via Oliveto bakery restaurant. And like always, we're chit-chatting. Pasquale did most of the talk that day.
Pasquale tells Ciro about a volcanic eruption in Chile. The volcano, Thera Hudson, sends a plume over the Andes Mountains into Argentina. There, in the wilds of Patagonia, it causes devastation.
The volcanic material crossed the Andes, went in Argentina and precipitated. The streams in Argentina got red, acidic and red. And this is exactly what we see in the Egyptian plague.
It's a revelation for Trevisanato.
So I began to realize that Plague 1 could have been caused by a volcanic eruption. At least there is a link there. So now the thing is, can we go to Plague 2 from this point onwards?
Plague 2 is the plague of frogs.
The odd thing is that they stay on the land. They're not going back to the water. Is there a link now to the first plague? Yes. Because, remember, the water was acidic and they found they couldn't go back. So at some point, they ended up staying in the land. And staying in the land, they ended up dehydrated and dead in the field, dead in the houses.
Now Trevisanato agrees with John Marr. The dead frogs and fish cause a chain reaction, providing nutrients for the next 2 plagues: the lice and the flies.
So far, we have 4 plagues in a row, all caused by the eruption of a volcano somewhere.
There are no volcanoes in Egypt. But across the Mediterranean Sea is one of the most active volcanoes of the Bronze Age. Mount Thera, now the island of Santorini. Around 3,500 years ago, it erupted.
The eruption of Thera was probably the same sort of size as the largest volcanic eruption we've seen in the last few hundred to 1,000 years.
The eruption pumps tons of ash and toxic gas miles up into the atmosphere.
The eruption threw out at least 30 cubic kilometers of rock as pulverized ash and pumice, but maybe as much as 60 or 90 cubic kilometers. So that sort of size eruption, you could imagine burying most of the United Kingdom under many tens of centimeters of volcanic ash.
Winds take the volcanic plume and blow it southeast towards the Nile Delta.
Volcanic ash knows no boundaries. We've seen that between Chile and Argentina, and neither did this ash that caused the plagues in Egypt.
Now Trevisanato must explain how the Theran eruption might cause Plague 5, the death of the animals. Like John Marr before him, Ciro looks carefully at the species mentioned in the Bible.
Usually people think about all animals, but actually, if you read the text, it will specify something very interesting. They're all herbivores.
As Marr discovers, these herbivores are vulnerable to different diseases. But they all eat the same thing: grass. Could a toxic volcanic plume affect Egyptian pastures? Ciro believes that it could.
This first rain is extremely acidic and carries toxic material with it. What happens is that the grass will immediately absorb this water, which is toxic, You're an herbivore, you eat, and what happens? You're eating poison. You're going to die from it.
Now Trevisonato is on a roll of his own. But can a volcano explain Plague 6? Boils on man and beast. Trevisonato learns that a plume can contain sulfur dioxide. If rain falls through the plume, the sulfur dioxide mixes with water. The product is sulfuric acid.
Plague 6, take-home lesson. What was it? It was a rain of mild sulfuric acid. And how do we know that? Because it caused the pustules, the blisters.
Trevisonato is now convinced that the 6th plague is not a disease at all. The boils and blains are actually acid burns. Now Ciro faces Plague 7, the hail. It's the plague that stopped John Marr in his tracks.
But Plague 7 now, the hail, how is that related to a volcanic eruption? It is. You still have some of the ash up in the air. So, you don't only have a big thunderstorm which rains down sulfuric acid, you can have other precipitations after that as well.
Trevisonato now believes he has explained the hail. He has 7 plagues under his belt. He believes they are all caused by a plume from the eruption of Mount Thera. Now Trevisonato faces uncharted territory. The 8th plague, Locusts.
These are bugs that come swarming in. This is something that would have gone far beyond what they would have been used to. Surely these are bugs they would have been familiar with, but this quantity of them rushing in this way is presented as something completely miraculous.
Trevisonato learns that locust swarms are not unknown in Egypt. They are thought to happen after rainfall allows an explosion in locust numbers. Trevisonato suspects that his volcanic plume affects Egyptian weather patterns and creates ideal conditions for locusts to swarm.
And now you have a humidity in Egypt, which is not the normal humidity, it's much higher. Because it is much higher, there are some organisms, invertebrates, that will proliferate in this kind of environment.
8 down, 2 to go. Now Trevisonato faces the 9th plague, the palpable darkness.
The 9th plague is the plague of darkness, which was so thick that Egyptians, it was as if you could touch it, they couldn't actually move. They were stuck in their places and couldn't do anything.
This is not just darkness that occurs on a daily basis. This isn't just what one experiences before they go to bed at night.
On the face of it, dust from a volcanic plume could explain the darkness. But now Ciro faces a critical problem. As a plague, the darkness seems too late in the sequence.
See, it's a palpable darkness. So, in my case, I put my hands in the little hair which is left, and I wonder, why is it number 9? It should have been at the very beginning. It should have been Plague 1.
It's a staggering blow. Ciro wonders if he might be wrong about the volcano after all. He looks again at the Chilean eruption and discovers that it happens in distinct stages.
I realized that the dynamics of this eruption, which is that it first started, it spewed some ash, that went over the Andes, went to Argentina, then stopped. Then it started again.
It's known as a biphasic eruption. Trevisanato discovers that patterns of ash deposit suggest that Mount Thera might behave in the same way. He believes that the first eruption sends a plume of ash and smoke directly across the sea into Egypt. This turns the Nile red with acidic fallout and unleashes the first 8 plagues. Then, a second eruption emits another plume, which blocks out the sun and causes the palpable darkness.
Thanks to this information now, Plague 9 is working as well. Now I can link Plague 9 to the other 8 plagues. So now we have a set, a complete set from 1 to 9, all caused by one single cause, which singles out this eruption as a biphasic eruption.
Trevisanato is thrilled. With only the 10th plague left, it seems he may be about to solve the mystery of the biblical plagues. Back in New York, disease detective Dr. John Marr is unconvinced by the volcano theory. The eruption of Mount Thera is commonly dated to around 1600 BCE. But most Bible scholars believe the Exodus occurs in the 14th century BCE. That's more than 200 years later.
I have read about the scientific theory of the volcano and the 10 plagues. It's provocative, interesting, but I don't buy it.
Marr dismisses the volcano theory as just a lot of hot air. The disease detective resumes his epidemiological investigation. So far, he has explained the first 6 plagues as a chain reaction set off by a toxic algal bloom in the Nile. The algal bloom seems to be a natural disaster or act of God. Maybe the 7th and 8th plagues are too. Marr discovers that even without a volcanic plume, it can hail in Egypt. He has felt the power of hail himself, caught out in a field in Montana.
I was belted for about a half an hour with hailstones the size of mothballs, and I was black and blue after that.
If hail in Montana can cause such injury, a heavier hailstorm in Egypt could be the 7th plague. Now he turns to the 8th, the plague of locusts. Marr learns that swarms of locusts can appear spontaneously all over Africa, usually after heavy rainfall followed by a drought.
There are billions and billions of locusts that can literally blacken the sky during the day, and they are voracious, and they would have completely cleared the Egyptian fields of their crops.
Like the hail, the locusts seem to have a natural explanation. But what about Plague 9? The plague of darkness.
This was a palpable darkness, something you could almost touch and feel. And it wasn't as if one were to go blind. It was something that was in the air, in the atmosphere.
Marr discovers that there is another natural phenomenon which could fit the description. Sandstorms.
The Egyptians have a number of different words for different types of sandstorms. One is called a kashin, and it occurs in the spring of the year, and it is sand that is like powdered sugar. Now this is very interesting because it can get in through even closed doors or locked windows.
Ma has explained the darkness without any volcano. He has 9 plagues under his belt. Now there's just one last plague to account for. The most terrible of them all. God sends the angel of death across the land of Egypt.
The 10th plague is the culmination of the other 9. It's the ultimate destruction.
The final plague, the most famous of them, is the death of the firstborn. Moses warns Pharaoh that the firstborn of all Egypt will be killed.
This terrifying miracle is remembered every year in the Jewish festival of Passover.
Even the Israelites are susceptible to this one. And as a result, they have to, through a special ritual, put blood on their doorposts so the angel of death, when it arrives in Egypt, doesn't destroy their firstborn.
Despite millennia of religious study, the final plague remains a mystery.
The 10th plague was the most inexplicable of all the plagues to attempt to give a scientific explanation to.
Ma cannot see any connection between the death of the firstborn and the first 9 plagues. He cannot think of a natural disaster which might explain it. Once again, the disease detective is stuck. Back in Toronto, Ciro Trevisanato still believes that the eruption of Mount Thera is responsible for the plagues. Despite the critics, he is confident the dates do match. The Bible records that after the plagues, the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. Then comes the destruction of the city of Jericho, carbon dated to around 1560 BCE.
If you take the date for the eruption of Thera, and if you take the date for the fall of Jericho, the time in between, if it's not exactly 40 years, it's roughly 40 years.
Trevisanato is convinced that the volcanic theory does explain the first 9 plagues. But what about the death of the firstborn? He rules out natural causes like disease.
If you have a disease that kills, for example, young people, not firstborn. The bacterium or the virus cannot tell the difference between the firstborn and secondborn.
Now Trevisanato is seized by an awful revelation. The explanation is not physical, but psychological.
We no longer have the ash or the plume directly involved. We have the psychological reaction in the people, which now says, we have seen this, we have seen the fish, we have seen the frogs, we have seen this other thing, we have seen the birds. Huh? Now we get this darkness that choked us. What's going on? What's next? We can't take it anymore.
Terrified by the plagues, the Egyptians try to appease their gods. Human sacrifice is not unknown in ancient Egypt. Pharaohs would have their servants killed to accompany them into the afterlife. Scholars believe the practice ended hundreds of years before the plagues. But perhaps there were exceptions.
Regular time imply regular sacrifices. These times are not regular. We have to do different sacrifices. We have to sacrifice what is closest, what is dearest to us. Our firstborn.
It's a darkly compelling theory. A sacrificial slaughter. The Egyptians create their own 10th plague. Back in New York, disease detective John Marr is also nearing the end of his quest. So far, he has 9 plagues under his belt. As he faces the 10th, he begins to see a pattern emerging.
Now, reflecting on the first 9 plagues, there was a leitmotif, and the one thing in common was a compromise of the food supply and the health of the Egyptians.
Now Marr has an epiphany. The 10th plague could be deadly food poisoning.
One explanation might have been the ingestion of contaminated grain.
First, hail and locusts decimate Egyptian crops. The plague of darkness prevents any remaining grain from drying in the sun. It is stored in underground granaries while still damp.
You would have a perfect setup for the elaboration of fungi.
Fungus on grain can harbor a microscopic killer, mycotoxin.
The particular mycotoxin, Stachybotrys atra, in sufficient dose, could cause internal bleeding into the lungs, into the internal organs, and there would be no demonstrable external cause or reason of death. It would just be sudden death.
The poisonous mycotoxin forms first on the exposed surface of the grain.
The first to eat would have been the oldest son or daughter, and they would have gotten a heavy dose of the mycotoxins on the superficial layers of this moldy grain.
It's a chilling conclusion. Marr's deadly chain of cause and effect has run its course to the very end.
So we can see in retrospect that plagues 7, 8, and 9 were a setup for the 10th plague.
It's the end of a long quest. Although 2 modern investigators pursue differing theories, they agree on one conclusion. The story of the 10 plagues, written thousands of years ago, is too accurate to be a myth.
I'm ready to put my hand on fire and swear, yes, indeed, the plagues of Egypt is based on facts.
I do believe that the account of the 10 plagues as described in the Bible is a faithful and historic and accurate representation of what actually happened.
Whether the plagues were caused by natural events or by acts of God remains, for now, a mystery.